My colleague Rachel Curtis and I designed this based on the best evidence we have of what makes for effective, robust strategy. And so we think effective strategy has 4 elements to it. It's focused on the instructional core, so really it's about what happens between teachers and students in classrooms. The second part is focus, coherence, and synergy. And the idea is it's focus narrowly on a few really high leverage things. The coherence means that those things fit together well, and the synergy means that the combination of them is greater than if you did them separately. So if you're working on, say, using data and a new math program, using math data can be more powerful than thinking of those as 2 totally separate things. They can be mutually reinforcing. That's what that one's about. The third one, the notion of both visionary and problem solving, is that effective strategy is both trying to go for that big why. What are you trying to accomplish? What audacious goal do you have on behalf of children? And also problem solving, because there are things that are getting in the way of that. What are the real problems and stumbling blocks? That's the third one. And the fourth one we call ownership and enactment throughout the system. And that means basically people throughout the system can tell you what the strategy is, what are we trying to do here, and they're on board with that being the direction of this system. What earlier today we were calling buy-in. Where do you think people most often say they struggle in their organizations? Which of these would you predict would be the weakest overall in people's self-assessment? So if you look at this, the dark green is a 4 on the rubric, light green is a 3, yellow is a 2, and the red is a 1. So you can see that when people self-assess, they self-assess ownership and enactment the lowest consistently. So on this graph, you can see that because the yellow and the red bars are a lot bigger. So basically what people say is, yeah, we're pretty focused on the instructional core, at least we're trying to be. And then it varies across the other ones. Now, I think focus, coherence, and synergy is an interesting one because people often think that they're more focused, coherent, and synergistic than they actually are. But I think it's quite obvious to people from the get-go that they don't really have the ownership and enactment. I think that's why the self-scores vary a bit there. Now, let me give you another data set. That's from a slightly different framework. This is from work I've done with colleagues around how to use data. So we made up this process called the data-wise improvement process. Absolutely nothing spectacularly magical about it. It's just like any other problem-solving process. And we have it in 3 phases: prepare, inquire, act, broken into 8 steps. So again, the point is not for you to use data-wise here, but just to be thinking about where, when people self-assess, do you think the weak spots are? So the prepare part, organize for collaborative work, build assessment literacy. Inquire is looking at your data overall, digging into student data, examining instruction. And then act is developing the action plan, planning how you're going to assess progress, and then actually doing something and assessing it. And the way the data-wise process works is it has that kind of foundation piece at the bottom, the prepare, and then the arrow bends back on itself because the idea is that what you learn is supposed to feed back into the next cycle, but you don't need to prepare every time. So that's the kind of goal there. Now, similarly, there's actually a rubric that goes with this on the DataWise site, but we often ask people just to use red, yellow, and green sticker dots. Like red means we don't really do this step, yellow, well, we kind of do, or we do parts of it, and green is like, we're good on this one. So again, when you look at that, where do you think that people self-assess the lowest? All right, so I do have stacked bar data for this, but it's a little overwhelming with 8 steps, so I'm just going to show you kind of an average. But you should know that in any of these steps, if we did this exercise of sticker dots in this group, you would see variation. You would see some people would have green on, every step would have green, yellow, and red on it, just across the room. But this is kind of a representation of the average. So building assessment literacy, like really understanding how to use assessments well, not so much. Examine instruction is definitely an Achilles heel in a lot of places. People say we're looking at a bunch of data, but we're not getting into each other's classrooms, we're really looking closely at our own instruction. But the basic trend is that it gets redder as you go through the process. So the most solid is usually that very first step of organizing for collaborative work. Like we have collaborative time, we have teams, at least we call them teams because they're groups of people that meet together. And we think we're kind of got the basic structure set up. But it gets redder and redder as you go around the circle. And what that means basically is that in practice, in most places, the arrow doesn't bend back on itself. Because you're not actually doing something, or if you're doing something, you're not learning from it. So instead of it being this nice kind of cycle that keeps feeding learning into itself, it's basically a series of straight lines. Like, we're going to try this thing, and maybe we'll try this, or maybe we just wrote the plan down, but we're not actually having the learning feed into the next thing. Okay, so this is really, really common patterns, and I presume shows up a little bit in your own work, or you probably wouldn't be here today. So that's great. Now we've got all sorts of data saying we've got a problem. Now what do we do, right? Let's try to understand the problem better as a way of working towards the solution. And this is, as I said at the beginning of the day, this is kind of counterintuitive because we usually think about solving problems as you got to come up with a solution as fast as you can. But that's actually part of what gets us into trouble in education. So what we're going to try to do is slow down that natural inclination and use sharpening and deepening the problem as a way of innovating and improving. So we're going to do that with this. And in fact, that language I think is really helpful for thinking about digging in. The symptoms being, that tree, that stuff you can see that's visible, and the roots being what's actually underlying. There are some things, sure, they might just be like viruses, like sit them out and they'll just sort of take care of themselves. But most of the things we really care about won't do that. And so it's kind of like if you think of this as a dandelion instead of an actual tree. Like in the dandelion, if you just pick the flower, like my 4-year-old likes to do, it comes back, right? But if you get it out by the roots, it goes away. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're going to use a process called 5 whys to help you dig into where your stuck places around implementation are in your own settings. How many of you have used this protocol before? Okay, so we've got a handful of people who are experienced at it, which is great. You can help us do it. And for a lot of you, this is going to be a new tool to test out for your toolbox. This process was really made popular. I don't know where it started, but it really made popular by Toyota. And not because Toyota wanted everybody else to use it, but because everybody else was curious about, why is Toyota suddenly the #1 car company in the world? And when people started looking at what is Toyota doing, what they realized is Toyota is learning better and faster than most other organizations about how to make cars better. And one of the big things that Toyota was doing was getting really good at diagnosing what was happening with problems. And they use this protocol called 5 whys. Another element of Toyota's success, which they stopped doing, which is part of why they had the recalls. This is all pre-recall, right? But they stopped doing the second part as well, which was they were really good at listening to the people on the floor. So they had all these mechanisms built in for the people closest to the ground to signal, hey, I've got an idea, or we've got a problem here. And when they stopped getting as good at that, that's when things started happening that led to the recalls. But all along the way, they've had this process called 5 whys to dig in. And it's called 5 whys because, wait for it, you ask why 5 times. Now, sometimes it doesn't work quite that simply. And as we try it out here, you'll see that it gets messy pretty fast. But the basic idea is kind of stick in the mess a little bit, and just by asking why 5 times, you're basically trying to kind of peel the onion on that symptom and try to get in what's really, really going on underneath. So usually it leads somewhere really interesting and productive, even if it gets highly messy. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice this process first in the whole group rather quickly, and then I'm going to give you time to do it at your tables. The basic way it works is you start with that symptom. Then you brainstorm hypotheses about why might that symptom exist, and you're trying to brainstorm those hypotheses based on actual evidence. Then you select a hypothesis to explore. It works great if you can explore a few hypotheses. For today, we're just going to practice with one. But you basically pick by thinking about which of these hypotheses, if they turned out to be true and we acted on them successfully, would be really high leverage against that symptom that we saw. And then you ask why 5 times on that hypothesis. It's called 5 whys because you keep asking till you get to something that feels deeper and actionable. Sometimes that happens in 4 whys, and sometimes it happens in 6, but usually around about 5 whys is when you get to somewhere actionable. Why is act and assess routinely the place where people self-assess, to be lowest? Now the trick is, all of these hypotheses might be true. And we could go through them with more time and sort of pressure check them for, do we have evidence? Like, do we have evidence that we actually have turnover? Do we have evidence that we're devoting our resources to other things? Do we have any evidence about perceived lack of time or people not wanting to do it? So you can kind of pressure check for evidence. And then what you do is, as I said, you pick 1, 2, or 3 hypotheses just to start with. And the way you pick is, again, if this turns out to be true and we act on it successfully, it's going to be really high leverage against that symptom. So when you look back at this list, it may be pretty hard to read from where you are, so I'll just recap them. Which one do you think is a good one to dive into and see where it leads us? Let's do the we don't know how to do it. The reason I tuned into this one is because this is the one that got the most emotional reaction in the room, which suggested to me that we were finally getting somewhere deeper. Like, not just the stuff you rattle off that's like you talk about all the time. Oh, we are not coherent, and we don't have a clear vision, and we don't have the tools, like all this like educator speak. But then when you said that one, people went, oh. And so you can tell you're getting somewhere deeply rooted when you start having like a little bit of the ooh kind of reaction. And that's what you're trying to get to, is the stuff that's underneath the surface that is invisible or that you don't talk about all the time. And that's the stuff that's really deeply rooted. Okay. Until you actually like make visible the invisible or make transparent the things that are deeply rooted, there's no way you can address them. And so it's actually should be really empowering, although maybe a little uncomfortable, to name these things. So I feel like if you get to the like part that feels like sort of squishy and wiggly and uncomfortable, that means you're getting somewhere good, because it's not the stuff that you normally talk about, so it's not the stuff that you normally do. So then now you know basically like, oh, we think like very deeply rooted is a need for control and a lack of trust. So anything we come up with, it's not entirely clear what the action step is there, but anything we come up with has to address those things, or we think it's ultimately not really going to move the needle on that symptom that we care about. So does that kind of make sense how the protocol works? Now, and so just a couple things about this. The difference between symptoms and causes, they're not the same thing. So you may experience the symptom as problematic, like a low test score or behavior or adults not doing what they said they would do. But just because it's a problem for you doesn't mean it's a problem. Like, it means it's a symptom. And just as you often think of a child's behavior is not actually the problem, it's communication about a problem that you have to figure out what it is, right? That's how symptoms are related to causes. So hopefully you had the experience with the 5 whys that both the product, what you're generating as your hypotheses and the roots that you surface, both the product and the process are valuable. So the conversations you're having are really important for part of getting unstuck. So hashing out, like, why do we think this is hard? You notice that there were all sorts of hypotheses about why things are, and that the conversation you're having is itself helping you figure out how to get unstuck, as well as what you actually surface. What that means is that it's really important who's in the conversation. So best to have in the conversation is a variety of people who are implicated in the symptom that you're talking about. So for example, very often teachers are implicated in the system and aren't at the table when we're talking about the diagnostics, which is fine if that's how your team is here today, because we're learning. But the conversation changes when there's a variety of the people implicated at the table. So the conversations, I promise you, are quite different if it's a group of teachers hypothesizing on something versus a group of administrators hypothesizing on something. Very often their hypotheses are about the other group first, and what the other group isn't doing. But if you've got a mix of folks at the table, then they can start talking about how the different hypotheses like interact with each other too. And they can start hearing what are the perspectives of other people. So that in and of itself, those conversations help you start getting unstuck. And then whatever you surface as the roots you're going after are really important. Now, all that said, I use this little protocol sometimes called I used to think and now I think. So it's like I used to think one thing, but now I think another thing. So I used to think it was really important to go after the deepest root that you possibly could. So whatever you surfaced as your deepest root, like just go after that hard. But now I think, it's actually a strategic leadership decision what route you go after. So you might decide, we're going to go after our third why, actually, because that feels like we can think of something to do about it. It feels like we have the capacity to do it, and we have the kind of authorization to do it, or I've got enough will that I think I can get away with that one, but I can't go after the deepest root yet. I have to get people a little more comfortable, or I have to get some additional resources, or I have to build my own confidence, or we need a little time on that one. So you can very intentionally choose not to go after the deepest root. It's still helpful to have surfaced the deepest roots, though, so that as you're acting, you can think about how is what I'm doing either opening some conversations that are going to let us go after something more deeply, or building our capacity in ways that we can go after the deeper stuff down the road. So it can be very intentional to not go after the deepest thing, but you want to be clear about why you're doing that.